welcome to Middle East Macro Media. Today, our guest is Nikita Singla, international trade, logistics, and inclusion specialist focusing on South Asia. Hi, Nikita. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Agnieszka. It's a pleasure.
So, with the India and US interim framework now in place, India's exporters stand to gain a tariff advantage over other regional competitors. How should South Asia's smaller exporters respond to the situation, in your opinion?
So, Agnieszka, India may potentially have a tariff advantage in the US market, but I think when we should look at the overall South Asia smaller exporters, it is very important to underline the fact that tariffs is only one part of the whole trade policy agenda. I think much more important today is to work around trade competitiveness. How do you make sure you reduce the cost of trade? How do you make sure you increase the predictability of the trade? How do you make sure you increase the efficiency, the effectiveness, and the speed of cargo movement? So I think these are the areas where, irrespective of who you are trading with, who your trade partner is, these are the areas the smaller South Asian exporters and importers actually must focus on much more. And actually, I've had the pleasure of working on, all of these themes across, with different departments of the government. When we look at the time of the trade, we have been tracking the time it takes for clearance of goods from our ports. And we have been doing this at 15 ports with the Government of India, Ministry of Finance over the last 5 years, where we know that, okay, this is the time it takes to clear goods at the ports, and this enhances the predictability eventually for exporters and importers within India as well as our foreign trading partners. And when it comes to the cost of trading, we are now working with the Ministry of Ports, Waterways and Shipping, where we are actually working on what does it actually cost to move goods within India and between India and the trading partners. And the last one is, how do you make sure the whole reliability of the supply chain is increased, where we are working more on the, the resilience of the trade architecture. So I think the whole sort of trade needs to be looked at from a trade facilitation viewpoint rather than just the tariff angle.
Mm-hmm. So you've worked closely on customs and logistics. So where is South Asia really making progress on digitizing customs? And where do the real problems remain?
Very good question, important question. I can speak for hours on this. I will try to be crisp. South Asia has made remarkable progress in terms of digitization of its different trade procedures. But different countries of South Asia are at varying levels of digitization. For example, India really had a jumpstart in 2020 when we introduced Turant customs. So Turant in Hindi stands for prompt. So we basically made the customs process faceless, contactless, and paperless, which basically meant that your cargo could be coming in at port A and your customs officer could be sitting at port B clearing that cargo. Of course, it has its initial teething issues which are being resolved, but largely the whole customs clearance process was made digitized. Bangladesh, started using the SAFTA platform, which is used globally for its customs clearance process. Bhutan introduced the ECMS, which is Electronic Customs Management System, in 2023. Again, which digitized its entire customs procedure. So there's a lot of digitization that has happened. But still, I think we have managed to digitize individual trade procedures, but I think the gaps still remain in end-to-end digitization of the entire supply chain. I'm, happy to give you just a quick examples for better context. For example, if I talk about Bangladesh, I think real-time digitization and digitalization of records are two very different things. When I was working in Bangladesh in 2024, I remember some of the trade procedures would actually be cleared manually from 8 in the morning to 8 in the evening. And then somebody at 8 in the evening would actually open up the system and digitalize all of those records. But that's not the digitization we are talking about, right? In Bhutan, I saw there were so many procedures which the Royal Bhutan Police was managing manually just because, they thought, oh, if we have an power failure, we will not have the backup of these files. So I think we also need to focus much more on the parallel infrastructural complementarities that need to be in place for the digitization to happen. In India, there's a lot of, you may be aware, there's a lot of cargo that needs clearance from these additional partner government agencies. For example, if it's a food product, it needs clearance from Food Safety and Standards Authority. If it's a plant, it needs an additional clearance from plant quarantine, animal quarantine, drug controller, wildlife crime control bureau. So we have all these additional partner government agencies from which you need NOC for clearance. And sometimes what happens is the individual customs procedures are digitized, but these additional government agencies are not digitized or not onboarded onto that digital platform. And the study that I was mentioning to you previously, where we were tracking the time it takes for clearance of cargo, we saw that it was taking over 200% of the time. Time was going up by 200% if the cargo was marked to one of these agencies for clearance. So, of course, the digitization is happening, but I think the digitization needs to happen in a more seamless fashion where you onboard all the various agencies that are there in a domestic ecosystem. So that's the one aspect of it. The second aspect is when I'm trading between two countries of South Asia, let's say India and Bangladesh are trading between each other. How do you make sure there is coordinated border management on the digitization procedures between the two countries? And, World Customs Organization has this framework for CBM, which is the coordinated border management. And one of the 4 pillars is on realigning and streamlining the IT procedures between the two countries. There has to be interoperability of digital systems. There have to be a seamless data exchange between the two systems. So all of that needs to be in place. So I think our real objective really has to be to move away from a single digital procedure to an integrated end-to-end digital supply chain, so that if you submit your information once is in the system, it is being really reused throughout the supply chain.
So what does a port of the future in South Asia look like if we look at the perspective of around 5 years?
How do you define a port of the future, right? I think that is a big question for us to answer before we even get into what makes a port of the future, or how do you make a port of the future? Because, Agnieszka, I'm sure you will agree with me that I think trade has never been more important than what it is today. I think ports have become such critical nodes of national security, right? Ports are no longer about physical infrastructure alone. Ports have really become like a very critical node of national security, physical infrastructure, as well as an end-to-end logistics ecosystem. So I think when you talk about port of the future, for me, what I think of is a nexus between expedited cargo movement and national security. Because on one hand, if you want your ports to be efficient, you want your port of the future to be a very efficient port where everything is digitized, everything is moving very fast and efficiently, it's predictable cargo clearance, everything is getting cleared within hours or within minutes of cargo arrival at the port. But when you do that, that means you need to have more green channel cargo, you need to have faster clearance. But does that come at the cost of national security? What is the trade-off that we are having with national security? And you may be aware, we have several examples across the globe. In 2018, we had this big ransomware attack in Port of San Diego, which had critically impaired the terminal operations at San Diego. In 2023, a similar attack was there at Port of Nagoya in Japan. And these are attacks that had repercussions in ports in South Asia. As far as Nhava Sheva in Mumbai, in India, the terminal operations were impacted to that extent. So I think when we talk about port of the future, there are several layers to this port of the future. And the most important layer is digitization. How do you make sure there are AI-enabled terminals there? How do you ensure the digital twins of all these different port systems are there? How do you make sure all the countries are at an equal level playing field when it comes to port community system or a maritime single window or a national single window? How do you make sure you're using predictive analysis for port operations, for terminal operations like yard planning, berth planning, etc.? So I think all of this needs to be addressed when we are talking about port of the future. And actually, I have just come back from Washington, where we launched the Ports of the Future partnerships between US and South Asia. It's a program of the US Department of State. where we are actually looking at partnerships for the American US, American private sector companies to come into South Asia's ports and assist in all these different areas of making the ports of the future. So as we work with various US technology providers on these digitization measures, one parallel and complementary layer to this is working on cybersecurity, because as some of these countries are in early stages of digitization, you want to make sure these digital systems are reliable and resilient enough. And these are the conversations we are having with US Coast Guard. How can some of the cybersecurity assessments can be conducted across ports in South Asia to make sure these digital systems are safe, in today's day and age. So for me, Port of the Future is really about making the port more efficient as well as more trusted. And how do you do both? That's the challenge of today.
I wanted to ask you about the resuming India-Pakistan trade. Setting politics aside, what would be the practical first steps to resume this bilateral trade? Which sectors, which routes would basically be the first one to be addressed? And what are the economic costs of this freeze in bilateral trade between India and Pakistan?
Interesting that you ask about this, because as you know, India-Pakistan trade has been suspended for a very long time now. And till 2019, India and Pakistan were trading. There were hiccups, but we had pretty much, we did have a stable trade relationship. And we were trading about $2.5 billion worth of trade till 2019. And 2019, after the attack in Pulwama, India imposed 200% duty on Pakistani imports coming into India. Then in the same year, when the J&K reorganization bill was passed in August 2019, Pakistan completely suspended economic diplomatic ties with India. So, that's where we are. This was 2019 August, and since then trade has been officially suspended. And in 2020, in fact, I spent several weeks in Amritsar, which is the border town on the Indian side along the India-Pakistan border, to see what is really the impact, because the narrative in Delhi and Islamabad was that we were hardly trading with each other. It was just $2.5 billion worth of trade. So even if you're not trading, how does it really matter? But when you look at the border economy, they have this whole border ecosystem around them. When I spent these weeks in Amritsar, I found that it's not just the traders whose life is impacted, but it's also these small restaurant owners, these tire mechanic shops, these gas filling stations. So all this entire ecosystem that's completely dependent on cross-border trade with the other country. And based on my research, we found out that, 50,000 people were impacted because of the suspension of this bilateral trade between India and Pakistan. And we have these people listed by names in the research. So it's really about putting a face. As you asked me, what did the freeze really do? What was the impact of the freeze? So this was the impact. 50,000 people just in the border town of Amritsar were impacted because of the suspension. Then we did a similar study in Jammu and Kashmir to see, because of the suspension of the cross line of control trade between the two countries, what was the impact? And about 20,000 people were impacted there. And Agnieszka, these are very personal stories. You would see people pulling their kids out of private schools and putting them into public schools because their father went out of business. You see people pulling out their family members out of hospitals because they couldn't afford the treatment anymore because the trade was suspended. So, we saw weddings getting called off. So it was really, you see the human impact of an economic phenomena like trade when you go to a border town. And since then, there have been some limited resumption to trade. We saw in 2020-21, where there was limited resumption of cotton, sugar, and pharmaceuticals, but very soon that was suspended again. So I think where we are today is one, if I talk about the Indian side, where we are today is one that Amritsar is, Amritsar is the border town that trades the most with Pakistan in terms of the land border trade. So one is, how do you make sure they have alternate sources of livelihood? When the both governments are still, whenever the trade discussions would restart, in the interim, what do we do for these traders in Amritsar? So that is, what are the alternate sources of livelihood that we can offer to them? And based on our extensive stakeholder consultations conducted in Amritsar, there are basically two things that we had highlighted. One was, you re-establish a rail link between two specific parts in Punjab, which is Patti and Makhu. And if you do that, the rail distance between Amritsar and Mumbai and Amritsar and Mundra would reduce by 250 kilometers. So, that gives access to a trader sitting in Amritsar. He can really access a seaport in Mundra or Mumbai and thereafter access the entire world for an export and import market. The second is, how do you re-establish or strengthen the air connectivity between Amritsar and the Middle Eastern or the Central Asian economies? So that's number two. And other than, other than these two, it is how do you really restart the trade? And that is where, one, I think we can look at re-honoring the South Asian Free Trade Agreement, because SAFTA is an agreement that's already in place between the South Asian countries. But because of India-Pakistan situation, the India-Pakistan trade was suspended. So they don't need to restart anything at a bilateral level. Both the countries could really just re-honor SAFTA, and that re-establishes a basic trading relationship. And the second thing that we can do, which is the last on my list, is we could have some specific commodities. Initially, the trade between India and Pakistan was based on a negative list, that everything else is allowed, but these negative list items are not allowed. So I think to restart trade, we could have a positive list to restart with. We can say that we will only trade in these specific commodities, where we know there is demand and supply. For example, cement, for example, gypsum, rock salt, dry dates, medicine. So we can have specific commodities where we know there is demand, and trade negotiations could restart on that. And a lot of track 1.5 and track 2 dialogues are in place to make sure that the trade negotiations continue.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nikita. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Pleasure was mine too. And thank you so much for having me on your show.
Thank you. Have a great day.